I know my children well. Blake sees land as numbers. Marlene sees inheritance as a ladder to power. I have watched too many families destroy themselves over greed. The one who deserves the land is not the one who profits from it, but the one who never tried to.
The biting cold wind of Montana swept across the rolling hills, carrying with it shocking news. Henry Caldwell, the legendary cattle baron who had transformed this barren land into an empire worth $48 million, had died suddenly. At the family cemetery, the atmosphere of the funeral was solemn and rigid. Luxury cars lined up one after another, expensive black suits filled the grounds, and ornate words of condolence were spoken without pause. Yet beneath that mask of grief were sharp, calculating eyes. Standing at the front was Blake Caldwell, the eldest brother and current manager of the ranch. A large man with a flushed face, he struggled to restrain his familiar temper, but his tightly clenched fists betrayed the ambition boiling inside him. Beside him stood Marlene Caldwell, the sharp-tongued younger sister, wife of a well-known local politician. Behind her oversized black sunglasses, Marlene's eyes were dry, sweeping quickly over each guest as if assessing their potential usefulness rather than sharing in mourning. And then, lost amid that glittering facade of hypocrisy, stood Ethan Caldwell, the youngest son, branded the family's black sheep. In his early 40s, carrying the scars of a failed marriage and barely surviving on manual labor at a local feed store, Ethan looked painfully out of place. His worn-out suit seemed too large for his thin, weathered frame. In the eyes of everyone present, Ethan was the very definition of failure, a man who never amounted to anything, completely harmless, and certainly with no chance of ever laying a hand on that massive inheritance. Blake shot his younger brother a contemptuous smirk without bothering to hide it. Marlene did not even stand near him, as if afraid Ethan's poverty might rub off on her expensive dress. Both of them were convinced that Ethan was nothing more than excess baggage, a speck of dust in the upcoming power game of inheritance. But they were wrong. Ethan stood there with his head lowered, silent like a rock in a raging current. No one knew that his silence was not the resignation of the weak, but the calm focus of a hunter patiently observing. He accepted the role of the outsider, accepted their contempt, but it was a strategic choice, absolutely not surrender. 3 days after Henry, the patriarch, was laid to rest, the fake atmosphere of mourning was quickly replaced by the suffocating tension of greed. The entire family gathered in the large oak-paneled study, once the untouchable sanctuary of the late father. The smell of old paper, ink, and invisible calculations lingered in the vast room, thickening the air. Seated at the center was the family lawyer, Mr. Thompson, an elderly man with reading glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. He slowly broke the seal on a thick file. The dry rustle of paper echoed sharply in the dreadful silence. Blake leaned back in a leather armchair, his imposing posture suggesting he had already claimed ownership of the place. Across from him sat Marlene, her sharp eyes fixed on the lawyer's hands, occasionally tapping her bright red nails on the polished wooden table, openly displaying her impatience. At the farthest corner of the room, Ethan sat quietly on a hard wooden chair, completely separated from his siblings, like an unwilling audience forced to watch the final act of a play. Mr. Thompson's voice droned evenly as he listed an array of enormous assets: 3,200 acres of fertile land, investment trust funds, and lucrative cash flow from oil and gas royalties. The total estimated value reached $48 million USD. At the sound of those numbers, Blake's eyes gleamed with ambition, while Marlene curled her lips slightly, the smile of a victor clearly etched on her carefully made-up face. However, Mr. Thompson paused briefly, adjusting his glasses, the specific distribution of these assets will only take place after all tax procedures and outstanding legal obligations have been fully resolved. Blake let out a dismissive breath and waved his hand arrogantly. Just get the paperwork done quickly. What matters is the end result. My father is gone. This ranch needs someone to run it, and there's no one but me. Marlene nodded in agreement. Exactly. We need liquidity soon to deal with my husband's political matters. Don't let bureaucratic paperwork waste our time. Both of them were confident they already held victory. To them, the lawyer's words were nothing more than tedious administrative formalities. They were too busy calculating how they would spend the money to notice a murmured, seemingly minor yet critically important sentence at the end of the document, spoken softly by Mr. Thompson. And the entire estate shall remain subject to any previously established legal instruments, if applicable. The sentence passed like a faint gust of wind. No one paid attention. No one except Ethan. His eyes, which had been staring blankly into space, suddenly narrowed slightly. Previously established legal instruments. The phrase rang in his mind like a warning bell. With the experience of someone who had quietly studied the law, Ethan understood this was not a throwaway sentence in an inheritance document. It was a back door, a variable that Blake and Marlene, blinded by arrogance, had completely overlooked. Ethan kept his expression neutral, revealing nothing, but suspicion had already begun to root in his mind. Something was not right, or something had been arranged long ago, something even the lawyer was deliberately leaving ambiguous. Night fell over the freezing land of Montana while Ethan quietly drove his old pickup back to his run-down rented apartment. Yellow light still spilled from the luxurious living room of the Caldwell family mansion. With no lawyer or outsiders present, Blake and Marlene finally revealed their true faces over expensive shots of hard liquor. Blake drained his glass in one gulp and slammed it onto the marble table, the sharp sound shattering the silence of the late night. He stood up and paced the room, the thrill of greed making it impossible for him to sit still. 3,200 acres, Blake growled hoarsely. Marlene, do you know real estate brokers from California are circling this place like vultures? If we break the ranch up and sell it right now, the return won't stop at $48 million. It'll be a mountain of cash. Marlene crossed her legs on the sofa, gently swirling the amber liquid in her glass, watching it shimmer with calculating eyes. She smirked slightly. You're right, Blake. My husband needs a large sum for his upcoming Senate campaign. We can't wait for Thompson's turtle-paced legal process to finish. We need to sell fast and split the money fast. The two siblings were united by a single goal, turning their father's blood and sweat legacy into cash as quickly as possible. To them, the ranch was nothing more than a commodity, but their calculations stalled for a moment when they thought of the third person. What about the youngest one? Blake frowned, contempt mixed with irritation flashing across his face. He's legally listed as an heir, too. If he suddenly insists on keeping the land, or worse, demands an equal share. Oh, please, Blake, you worry too much. Just look at him, a complete failure. Divorced, a hired laborer, barely scraping by. He's the easiest type of person in the world to manipulate. She leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially, as if even the walls might be listening. Ethan is desperate. For someone like him, money is everything right now. We don't need to give him a fair third. We'll push him out of the game. You mean, Blake narrowed his eyes, beginning to understand. Pressure him, said Marlene firmly, or lure him. We'll make him believe the ranch is drowning in debt, and the only way out for him is to take a small support payment and sign away his inheritance rights. What would someone as weak as Ethan do? He'd panic and sign immediately, grab the money, and run. The two siblings clinked their glasses, the sharp ring of glass against glass sounding like coins hitting the floor. They were certain Ethan was nothing more than a tiny risk, a disposable pawn on the chessboard they believed they controlled. They had no idea that underestimating this black sheep was the first fatal mistake in their perfect plan. Ethan sat at the far end of the dining table, quietly cutting his steak, completely isolated from the clinking glasses and the fake laughter of his siblings. He wore a worn flannel shirt with a frayed collar, an outfit utterly out of place among Blake's polished suits and Marlene's expensive silk dress. His very presence seemed to irritate them. After several rounds of drinks, the alcohol began to fuel Blake's arrogance. He slammed his glass down on the table, his bloodshot eyes locking onto his youngest brother. "Hey, Ethan," Blake boomed, his voice thick with mockery. "I heard the feed store where you're working is about to lay people off. I'm curious, how are you planning to handle next month's electricity bill?" Marlene let out a soft giggle, lifting her napkin to dab the corner of her mouth, her tone sugary yet venomous. "Oh, Blake, don't worry. Ethan's used to living frugally. And I heard his ex-wife is asking for higher alimony again, isn't she? Must be pretty tight right now." The household staff standing around the room lowered their heads, hardly daring to breathe, feeling secondhand shame for the pitiful youngest son. But Ethan did not lift his head. His hand calmly brought food to his mouth, ignoring the barbs aimed straight at him. Ethan's silence drove Blake mad. It felt like punching cotton. Unable to restrain his aggression, Blake slammed his hand onto the table, sending plates and silverware clattering. He leaned forward, spewing the cruelest words he had prepared. "Don't play deaf with me. I'll make your position very clear. This ranch is a multi-million-dollar business. It needs great minds to run it. A complete failure, someone living off assistance and breaking his back doing grunt work like you, should never even dream of touching Dad's inheritance. Do you understand?" The words were like a bucket of ice water thrown straight into Ethan's face in front of everyone. The room fell dead silent. Marlene curled her lips, waiting for a weak reaction, anger, or better yet, humiliating tears. But no. Ethan slowly set his knife and fork down and wiped his mouth with his napkin, unhurried and composed. He looked up and met Blake's eyes for a brief moment. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet, restrained pity. Without saying a word, Ethan pushed his chair back and stood. He adjusted his collar and turned his back, walking out of the large dining room. His footsteps echoed steady and firm across the wooden floor, leaving behind the stunned silence and the smug laughter of two hollow victors. They believed Ethan had fled in shame, unaware that he had just left to begin preparing his counterattack. Ethan's silent departure from that dinner did not satisfy Blake and Marlene. On the contrary, it acted as a trigger for a more ruthless, full-scale assault. They abandoned subtle hints and sarcastic jabs and shifted to a strategy of direct psychological warfare designed to break the youngest brother's will. Every afternoon after work, the mailbox outside Ethan's rundown rental apartment was stuffed with thick envelopes stamped in bold red from prestigious law firms across the state. These were letters Blake had paid to have drafted, painting a dark and terrifying financial picture of their father's estate. Inside were fabricated debts, enormous unpaid tax obligations, and fake legal risks, all meant to plant a paralyzing fear in Ethan's mind that inheriting the ranch was not a blessing, but taking on a crushing burden that would bankrupt him and land him in prison. The paper attacks were not enough. Marlene then played her strategic card. Her husband, a seasoned politician with a cold, manufactured smile, personally showed up at Ethan's workplace. He never stepped out of his sleek black car, merely rolled the window down far enough to look at Ethan drenched in sweat, hauling heavy sacks of livestock feed. In the tone of a superior granting mercy, he advised him, "Ethan, you know my connections in this town run deep. I don't want to see my brother-in-law torn apart by creditors or dragged into legal trouble. Someone simple like you can't fight a system like this." The words were gentle, but the threat was unmistakable. If Ethan did not comply, his already difficult life could be crushed by political power at any moment. The campaign reached its peak on a cold, rainy morning. A courier delivered an express package directly to Ethan. Inside was a pre-drafted legal document titled Voluntary Waiver of Inheritance Rights. Clipped to the front was a check for $250,000, a number large enough to blind any desperate man. In the attached letter, Blake wrote briefly but arrogantly, "This is the only and most generous way out for you. Take it, pay off your debts, and disappear to start over somewhere else. Don't be stupid and get dragged into the ranch's debt." To Blake and Marlene, this was the perfect move, carrot before the stick. They were certain Ethan, the poor brother buried in hardship, would tremble as he signed in fear and gratitude. What they could not see was the moment Ethan held the file in his dimly lit apartment. His hand did not shake. He did not look at the check. His eyes were fixed on the waiver clauses. His gaze was sharp and calculating, not of prey and panic, but of a hunter searching for a fatal flaw in his enemy's trap. Instead of trembling and signing the waiver to claim the $250,000 USD as his siblings expected, Ethan took a half-day off work the next morning. He did not go to the bank. Instead, he drove his old pickup straight to the county clerk's office, where all public land records for the area were kept. Entering the dusty government building filled with the smell of old paper, Ethan still looked like his usual disheveled self in worn work clothes. The records clerk glanced at him with sympathy, assuming he was just another poor farmer seeking debt extensions. But when Ethan spoke, the atmosphere shifted. "I need certified copies of the land records for parcels 402 and 403 owned by Henry Caldwell," Ethan said, his voice low, clear, and firm, without the slightest hesitation of someone uninformed. "And please include all liens and easements recorded within the last 5 years." The clerk froze for a second before hurriedly retrieving the files. When the thick stack of documents was placed on the table, Ethan showed no confusion at the maze of numbers and dry legal terms. He sat down and pulled a yellow highlighter from his chest pocket. If anyone had been watching him, they would have witnessed a strange transformation. The dull, resigned look he usually carried vanished, replaced by eyes sharp as scalpels. His fingers skimmed rapidly across tiny lines of text that would make most people dizzy. He flipped through contracts with the speed and confidence of a professional, not a laborer from a feed store. Ethan stopped at one page, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly into a knowing half-smile. He compared the fabricated debt document Blake had sent him with the county's original records. The numbers did not match. The debts Blake invented to scare him simply did not exist in the public system. "Interesting," Ethan muttered, circling a small clause regarding agricultural land transfer regulations, something his siblings had deliberately ignored. The way he processed information, the way he marked margins with specialized legal symbols, radiated a chilling professionalism. At this point, if a camera had been rolling, the audience would begin to feel uneasy. The man sitting there was not merely pitiful Ethan. He looked like a wolf in sheep's clothing, silently checking the sharpness of his claws before entering the real hunt. After uncovering suspicious inconsistencies in the public records, Ethan did not waste a single second. He drove straight to Thompson Law Office, which held the original documents of the Caldwell family will and trust. Unlike his usual meek demeanor, Ethan entered the office with long, decisive strides. Before the secretary could announce him, he pushed open the door and walked straight into Mr. Thompson's private office. The elderly lawyer startled, dropping his pen, his face flashing with confusion as he saw the family's failure standing there with an unfamiliar presence. "Mr. Thompson," Ethan said without polite greetings, his calm voice carrying immense weight, "I want a complete copy of the Henry Caldwell Trust, especially Amendment Number 3, executed exactly 12 years ago." Mr. Thompson's expression shifted. Sweat formed on his forehead despite the air conditioning running at full blast. He fumbled with his glasses, nervously flipping through the files on his desk as a formality. Ethan," he stammered, avoiding direct eye contact, "I've checked very carefully. There is no amendment from 12 years ago in the official records. Perhaps your father once intended to draft one, but that document was never finalized or signed. It was only a draft that was discarded." The room fell into deadly silence. Ethan stared at the man his father had trusted implicitly. He knew the lawyer was lying. 12 years earlier, his father had called him late at night, his voice filled with emotion, speaking about an important decision to protect the ranch's future. An legal instrument as serious as an irrevocable trust could not simply be a draft that vanished without a trace. Ethan slowly placed both hands on the desk and leaned down until he was eye level with the lawyer, his voice low and sharp. "A notarized document doesn't just evaporate unless someone deliberately removes it from the file. You know how severe a violation of professional ethics that is, don't you?" Mr. Thompson's face went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He did not confess, but the fear in his eyes said everything. A powerful hand, undoubtedly Blake and Marlene, had interfered, coercing or bribing the lawyer to make damaging evidence disappear. Ethan straightened up and adjusted his collar. He did not need to hear anything else. "Fine. If it's not here, I'll find it somewhere you can't reach." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving the old lawyer slumped in his chair, drowning in regret and fear. Ethan understood now. This was no longer just a family dispute. It had become a criminal case of deception and betrayal. Leaving the law office with tightly restrained anger, Ethan did not return to his rundown rental apartment. He drove his old pickup straight toward the dilapidated barn hidden behind the ranch garden, the place storing his late mother's keepsakes, which Blake planned to throw away the following week. In the dim twilight filtering through the gaps in the rotting wooden walls, Ethan knelt beside his mother's rusted iron chest. He rummaged through piles of old clothes and yellowed photo albums until his fingers touched a brown leather envelope carefully hidden at the very bottom. This was the item his mother had secretly handed him on the night she took her last breath, along with a single instruction: "Only open this when you truly need to protect this home." Ethan pulled out a stack of documents stamped with a bold red notarization seal, Trust Amendment Number 3. It had never been destroyed, just as the lawyer had lied. It was right here, intact and fully legally binding. And this was the moment the curtain was finally lifted on Ethan's true identity. Blake and Marlene had always mocked Ethan as a college dropout, a stupid loading dock laborer, but they had made the mistake of their lifetime. Ethan had not dropped out because he was incapable. 12 years earlier, he had been the top student in the contract law department at the state university. He was forced to suspend his studies to return home and care for his mother when she was battling cancer, while his father was consumed by work and his siblings were busy building their own careers. No one knew that during all those years working at the feed store, just to survive,
Ethan had secretly worked online as a senior paralegal, specializing in complex inheritance disputes. He was not an uneducated countryman ignorant of the law. He was an expert hiding beneath dirt-stained clothes. Ethan's eyes moved rapidly across the clauses with the sharpness of a real attorney. He stopped at Article 14, Heritage Protection Clause. His father's voice seemed to echo through every line. To prevent the ancestral land from being divided due to momentary greed, ultimate control of the Caldwell Ranch and the trust shall not belong to the eldest child, but shall be granted entirely to the child who has never financially benefited from the family, has never borrowed from the common fund, and is the only one who remained to keep the land. Ethan clenched the documents tightly. He had never asked his father for a single dollar. He lived by his own labor and paid his mother's medical bills himself. This clause had been written precisely for him. The corner of Ethan's mouth lifted, but not with the familiar resigned smile. It was the smile of someone holding the ace card. His siblings believed they were playing chess against the useless pawn, never realizing that the pawn had already crossed the board and been promoted to a queen long ago. The counterattack had officially begun. Early the next morning, while cold fog still clung to the Montana fields, Blake and Marlene sat confidently inside the town's most luxurious real estate brokerage office. Across from them sat representatives of an investment conglomerate, along with a contract for the outright sale of the first 1,000 acres of land worth millions of dollars. Blake held a gold-plated pen, a victorious smile on his lips, preparing to sign the document that would carve up his father's legacy. But before the pen could touch the paper, the conference room door burst open. A court officer stepped inside, followed by a clerk from the Superior Court. The air in the room froze solid. "Mr. Blake Caldwell? Ms. Marlene Caldwell?" the officer called out loudly, showing no regard for their status. He slammed a red-stamped file onto the glass table. "This is a temporary restraining order, TRO, issued by the court. All assets belonging to the estate of Henry Caldwell, including land, bank accounts, and trust funds, are hereby frozen. All transfers, sales, and transactions are immediately suspended due to suspected fiduciary fraud." The investment representative stiffened, quickly pulling back the contract and shaking his head. "We do not deal with disputed assets." With that, he grabbed his briefcase and left, abandoning the stunned Caldwell siblings. Blake trembled as he picked up the order. His eyes bulged when he saw the plaintiff's name on the first line, Ethan Caldwell. "That ragged bastard! He dares to play me?" Blake roared like a wounded animal. He violently swept the tray of glasses off the table, shattering them across the floor. He could not believe that the brother he had treated like an insect had delivered such a precise legal strike, cutting off his cash flow right under his nose. Marlene's face drained of color. She collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking as she called her husband. "Something's wrong. The assets are frozen. We can't access the money. The campaign." Her voice dissolved into panic. Without cash by next week, her husband's political career would collapse and their hidden debts would be exposed. The polished masks of respectability and success fell away completely. They were no longer privileged heirs. They were revealed as greedy, desperate people losing control. Blake's personal lawyer skimmed the lawsuit and whispered in fear, "This filing is flawless. Every piece of evidence, every cited statute is airtight. Sir, whoever drafted this is not an amateur. We're facing a true expert." Blake ground his teeth, veins bulging along his neck. He realized then Ethan had not merely filed a lawsuit. Ethan had declared war, and the first shot had struck them straight in their vital organs. The court's asset freeze did more than stop the flow of money. It triggered a full forensic audit of all Caldwell Ranch operations. Under the harsh lights of independent investigators, the dark corners Blake and Marlene had carefully concealed were stripped bare. Desperate for cash, Blake made the fatal mistake of cornered men. Late at night, he secretly accessed the banking system, attempting to wire $2 million USD to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. What he did not know was that Ethan, armed with sharp legal foresight, had requested real-time transaction monitoring. The transfer was immediately blocked, exposing a trail of forged documents bearing their late father's signature, frauds Blake had committed for 3 years to siphon funds from the company. The trap snapped shut, and Blake had handcuffed himself. On the other side, Marlene was betrayed by the very power she had always taken pride in. She frantically called judges she knew, even stormed into the Chief Justice's office to apply pressure and delay proceedings. But faced with overwhelming financial fraud evidence against Blake, no one dared intervene. Her husband's political allies fled like plague carriers. The final blow came when her husband, fearing scandal that could cost him his Senate seat, issued a cold public statement. "I have no involvement in, nor do I support the unlawful actions of my wife's family." Marlene collapsed completely, isolated amid a storm of public condemnation. But the final crushing blow, the one that completely destroyed the fortress of lies, came from lawyer Thompson. Unable to withstand subpoenas and the threat of permanent disbarment, the old lawyer chose to salvage what little honor remained. In the interrogation room, he broke down in tears and confessed it was Blake who had threatened his daughter's safety, forcing him to conceal the trust amendment from 12 years earlier and ignore the embezzlement. Thompson's confession was the final nail in the coffin of the siblings' ambition. The glamorous velvet curtain was ripped apart, revealing decay and guilt beneath. The legal system they had arrogantly believed could be bent with money now turned back on them, crushing them with overwhelming force. While Blake and Marlene drowned in subpoenas, scandals, and public disgrace, one figure remained utterly still, solid as bedrock beneath a raging sea. That man was Ethan. When the court stripped Blake of his authority over the estate and ordered him into custody for financial fraud, Ethan showed no triumph. He did not smirk as his brother was led away in handcuffs. He did not gloat when Marlene collapsed in tears outside the courtroom. Ethan understood something they never had. Loud revenge is for the powerless. True power speaks best through silence. In the hearings that followed, Ethan stunned everyone present. The farmhand brother stood before seasoned attorneys and veteran judges with a calm, unshakable presence. He never raised his voice, never appealed to emotion. He argued only with law, precise documents, exact clauses, and evidence cited down to the final comma. Whenever the opposing counsel tried to deflect or distort, Ethan simply slid another document across the table. "Your Honor," he said evenly, his voice carrying through the chamber, "I am not here to claim more than my share. I am here to ensure my father's will is carried out exactly as written. Numbers do not lie, and truth does not need to shout to be heard." The courtroom grew quiet. People who once dismissed him as a failed son now watched with uneasy respect. They realized Ethan had never been weak. He had been waiting, observing, enduring, sharpening his blade in the shadows. He was a master chess player who had sacrificed pawns only to reveal a checkmate no one saw coming. When Ethan exited the courthouse as the court-appointed legal controller of a $48 million estate, he didn't celebrate. Instead, he drove straight back to the farm. There, he gathered the frightened workers, men and women who feared losing their livelihoods.
Ethan laid out a clear operational plan and guaranteed their jobs. Only then did the truth fully sink in. The man they had underestimated the most was the only one who truly knew how to steer the ship. The final hearing unfolded in absolute silence. All eyes followed Ethan as he stepped forward, not with legal paperwork, but with a worn leather journal. His father's journal. Ethan opened to the final entry and began to read. His voice was steady, but the room felt heavy, as if Henry Caldwell himself had returned. I know my children well. Blake sees land as numbers. Marlene sees inheritance as a ladder to power. I have watched too many families destroy themselves over greed. The one who deserves the land is not the one who profits from it, but the one who never tried to. No one breathed. Blake stared at the floor, fists clenched. Marlene turned away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Ethan continued, his voice tightening slightly. Ethan, you never asked me for anything. You gave up your future to care for your mother. You know every worker by name. You know what each field needs when the weather turns. They call you a failure. I call you patient, compassionate. You were never my backup plan. You were my choice from the beginning. The truth hit the courtroom like a breaking dawn. Ethan had never been abandoned. His silence had been the final test of character, and he alone had passed. The trust amendment was not a loophole. It was a father's deliberate final act of protection. Blake was sentenced to years in federal prison for fraud and forgery. Marlene's husband divorced her to protect his political career. She left town quietly, cast out by the elite circle she once ruled. They lost everything: wealth, reputation, family. Upon formally assuming control, Ethan shocked the entire county. He sold not a single acre. Instead, he transferred all 3,200 acres into the Caldwell Family Preservation Trust. The profits did not flow into his pocket. They funded lifetime pensions for long-serving workers. They built scholarships for underprivileged children, kids like Ethan once was, who needed opportunity, not pity. Those who once mocked him now returned, asking to lease land or partner with the very man they had dismissed. The story ends at sunrise over the Montana plains. Ethan stands alone on the highest hill, wind pulling at his coat, eyes sweeping across the land stretching endlessly before him. He does not smile in victory. He stands in quiet fulfillment, having protected not just an inheritance, but a legacy.